The winter that year arrived quietly. There was no announcement, no dramatic snowfall at first. Just colder mornings, breath turning visible in the air, and the sea growing darker each day as if it were pulling its memories closer to itself. In that small coastal town, winter didn't rush, it waited. And everyone waited with it. The houses stood close together, wooden and modest. Their windows larger than necessary, as if built to hold more light than the days could offer. Inside one of them, the smell of pine slowly began to replace the smell of summer. The Christmas tree hadn't been decorated yet. It leaned slightly to one side in the corner of the living room, needles falling softly onto the rug, as if even it was settling in. The children sat on the floor, watching the adults move around the room. Not impatient, not loud, just watching. Winter had a way of making voices lower. It made laughter gentler. Every sound seemed to matter more. Outside, the wind pushed against the shore. The beach looked nothing like it did in July. No towels, no shouting, just sand hardened by cold and waves that came in slower, heavier, like they were carrying weight from somewhere far away. The children stepped onto it anyway, bundled in coats too big for them, boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. The sea didn't feel welcoming, but it felt honest. It always did. They didn't stay long. Winter adventures were short back then. The cold decided when things ended. And when they returned home, cheeks red, fingers numb, the warmth inside felt almost unreal. The lamps glowed softly. Curtains were drawn. The world outside became something to observe rather than endure. The decorations came out one by one. Lights tangled from last year. Ornaments wrapped in old newspaper. Nothing matched, and that was the point. Each piece carried a memory, though no one said it out loud. Someone untangled the lights slowly, patiently, knowing that rushing would only make it worse. When they finally blinked on, the room changed. Not brighter, warmer, fuller. The children were given small tasks. Hold this. Hand that over. Be careful. They took it seriously. This wasn't play. This was tradition. As evening fell, snow finally started to come down. Not the heavy kind. Just enough to soften the edges of everything. Through the large window, the outside world looked quieter, cleaner, untouched. The lights from inside reflected back, turning the glass into a mirror of warmth. Neighbors passed by earlier that day. Short visits. A wave, a smile. A plate of cookies exchanged for nothing in return. No one stayed long. Winter nights belonged to families. Dinner was simple, familiar. No one tried to impress anyone. Food wasn't the center of the evening, it was the excuse. The real gathering happened afterward, when plates were cleared and chairs pulled closer together. The children sat near the tree, legs crossed, faces lit by the colored lights. The adults took their usual places, not assigned, just remembered. Someone mentioned how cold it used to get. Someone else nodded. Time passed, but not forward. It moved inward. There was no countdown. No loud celebration waiting for the clock to change. The clock was there, ticking steadily, but no one stared at it. Midnight would come whether they watched or not. What mattered was the quiet, the shared silence that didn't need filling. One of the children yawned. Another leaned against a shoulder. Winter had always been honest about endings. When the night was done, it said so. They were carried to bed one by one, coats folded, shoes lined up neatly by the door, still dusted with sand and snow. The tree lights were left on, just a few, enough. The adults remained in the living room, sitting longer than necessary. No one rushed to clean up. No one checked the time. Outside, the sea continued its steady rhythm, unchanged by dates or calendars. The year changed without ceremony. No one shouted. No glasses were raised. No wishes were announced, because in that room, in that moment, nothing felt missing. Years later, people would try to remember when things became louder, when celebrations became bigger and quieter, moments harder to find. They wouldn't pinpoint it exactly. They never could, but they would remember winters like that one. They would remember how the cold made warmth feel earned, how being together felt like enough, how the future didn't need to be named to be hopeful. That was what New Year felt like back then. Not a beginning, but a promise that what mattered most was already there, and it was warm. Asterisk, asterisk. The snow didn't melt anymore. It stayed. It covered the beach, the streets, the rooftops, turning familiar places into something quieter, almost sacred. The children pressed their noses to the window in the mornings, looking out not with excitement, but with curiosity. Winter wasn't something to conquer. It was something to move within. School felt different that time of year. Mornings were darker, afternoons shorter. Everyone carried the season with them on their coats, in their voices, in the way they walk. After classes, the children returned home faster, eager not for television or toys, but for warmth, for the feeling of coming inside while the world stayed cold. Sometimes they would walk down to the shore again, even though there was nothing to do there. No swimming, no running, just standing, watching the waves break against the frozen edge of sand. The sea never froze completely. It resisted. It remembered summer longer than anything else did. The adults noticed things too. Small things. How the house felt fuller in winter, even when fewer people came by. How conversations slowed down. How evenings stretched without effort. There was time, and it wasn't being chased at night. The tree lights became the only decoration that mattered. Everything else faded into the background. The children lay on the rug, staring up at the branches, tracing the glow with their eyes, inventing stories without speaking them aloud. Silence wasn't empty. It was shared. Someone would eventually say it quietly, that winter used to feel longer. Someone else would answer that it still was, if you let it be. No one argued outside. The town prepared for nothing in particular. Stores didn't change overnight. Music didn't pour from every corner. There were no banners counting down days. Just routines softened by cold. The children didn't know it then. But this was the part that would stay with them. Not the date, not the year, but the way time felt suspended, as if life itself had paused just long enough to be noticed. When the snow finally began to thin and the light slowly returned, nothing dramatic happened. Winter didn't leave in a rush. It loosened its grip gently, like someone stepping back rather than walking away. Years later, long after the houses changed and the shoreline shifted, long after winter celebrations became louder and brighter and faster, they would think back to moments like these, not because they were perfect, but because they were real, because they were quiet, because they asked for nothing more than presence, and because, for a brief season, being together felt like the only thing that mattered. The days after New Year passed without anyone marking them. There were no sharp lines between one day and the next. Morning simply followed night, and winter stayed exactly where it was. The children stopped asking what day it was. It didn't matter. Time felt softer when it wasn't being counted. The house settled into a quiet rhythm. The Christmas tree remained in the corner longer than planned. No one said when it should come down. Its lights would turn on each evening, fewer each night, until eventually only a small section glowed, like a memory refusing to fit all at once. Needles continued to fall onto the rug, unnoticed, accepted as part of the season outside. The town moved slowly. Footsteps crunched over snow-covered sidewalks. Breath hung in the air longer than words did. People spoke less, but when they did, it felt intentional. Conversations weren't rushed. They didn't need to go anywhere. The children found new ways to play indoors, games that didn't require much movement, card decks worn at the edges, puzzles missing pieces that everyone pretended not to notice. They learned patience without realizing it, learned how to sit with each other without needing constant distraction. Sometimes the power would flicker during storms, the lights would dim, then return. Each time, everyone paused, not in fear, but in awareness. When the lights came back, it felt like a small reassurance, quietly given. The sea continued to change color. Some days it was steel gray, other days nearly black. It reflected the sky more than the season. The children still visited it, standing at a distance, scarves pulled tight around their necks. They watched it the way you watch something older than yourself. Something that doesn't hurry because it doesn't need to. Inside, evenings stretched gently. Someone read aloud from an old book. Someone else listened without fully following the story, caught in with the sound of a familiar voice. The children leaned against cushions, eyelids heavy, not fighting sleep. There was no need to stay awake for anything special. Nothing was about to be missed. Meals remained simple: soup, bread. Leftovers warmed slowly, the kitchen filled with quiet movement rather than noise. Plates were washed by hand, dried carefully, stacked neatly. Even chores felt slower in winter, as if rushing would be disrespectful to the season. Occasionally, someone would mention the future. Not plans, just vague ideas, things that might happen when the weather changed. When the days grew longer again, the children listened, but didn't attach themselves to those thoughts. The future felt far away, and that was comforting. Nights came early, curtains closed before darkness fully settled, lamps cast steady pools of light. Shadows softened corners. The world outside felt distant, contained behind glass and wood. The children began to sleep deeper. Dreams came easier in winter. Mornings arrived quietly, with frost on the windows and muffled sounds from outside. Snow made everything quieter, including thoughts. There were moments when nothing happened at all. Entire afternoons passed with no event worth remembering on its own. And those were the moments that mattered most. Years later, when life began to move faster, when calendars filled and celebrations demanded attention, those empty spaces would return to them unexpectedly. In the middle of noise, they would remember what it felt like to sit in a room where nothing was expected. They would remember winter not as cold, but as clarity, not as absence, but as presence. They would remember a time when being together didn't need explanation, when joy wasn't loud, when hope didn't announce itself. That winter didn't teach them how to celebrate. It taught them how to stay. And that lesson stayed with them far longer than the season ever did.